Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new year and the Good Roads podcast. I am Jared LeMay, and with the new year comes the Good Roads Conference with plenty of planning and promotion, led by my co-host Thomas Barakat. What can the people expect from this year's conference, Thomas?
Well, it's another jam-packed schedule, Jared. Amazing speakers, study tours, and a keynote presentation by Jeff Speck, who is joining us today.
Right. So that all sounds exhilarating, insightful. And if you want to see what all the excitement's about around this epic event, or if you know and you're excited to get back and get all your questions answered, register at goodroads.ca/conference. We've got all our information there. We've got an agenda as well, a tentative agenda, but we're updating daily. Keep an eye on that. So like Thomas said, walking right into today's episode, our guest today is a city planner who advocates internationally for more walkable cities. He led Speck & Associates, a private design consultancy serving mainly American cities, both large and small. He's also an author of books such as Walkable City Rules and the Smart Growth Manual. And more importantly, he will also be a speaker at the 2024 Good Roads Conference, as Thomas alluded to. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff Speck. Thanks for taking the time to sit down and chat with us. This is going to be a great primer for our members who attend this year's conference and hopefully help spread the gospel of walkable cities to those who can't make it this year.
Well, thank you, Jared and Thomas. I'm worried I might give too much away and then people will feel they don't need to come. But hopefully this will just be a little amuse-bouche in anticipation of the... You guys speak French up there, right? So
Oui.
Some of you.
Oui, yes.
I have not been in Canada in years, although I was considering it very seriously until the moment of the last presidential election. My greatest fears were not realized, but you may see me in 2025. We'll see what happens. I was talking to Jen Keesmaat about what it would be like to operate my planning firm out of Toronto. And I should say, just to update my bio, this is a big month for Speck & Associates because I've actually reformed the company with a partner, Chris Dempsey, who's a real transportation maven here in New England. So now my firm is called Speck Dempsey.
Speck Dempsey, we will update that.
And I look forward to sharing our work and the issues that we're attacking during my visit there.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned Jennifer Keesmaat because my first conference, which was about 7 years ago, she was a speaker at. So maybe we can get her down. We can get a little reunion going on for you guys.
We invited her to CNU, the Congress for New Urbanism, many years ago, which is where I first met her. Yeah, she was very encouraging that I could still even do American work if I lived in Canada.
All right. Well, let's dive right into the excitement that is walkable cities. I guess let's start everything off and let's get everybody up to speed. Can you give us a brief overview of like the key principles behind walkable cities and why is it important for urban development?
So my trademark term, not really trademark, is Walkable City, singular, which is the name of my best-selling book, which I'm told is the best-selling urban planning book of this century. Yay, which makes me very happy. And I think it's important to communicate that I came into this not being focused on walking or health or the physical act of getting around on 2 feet, but rather as a city planner, trained as an architect, who for many years, particularly with my colleagues and mentors, Andre Stwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who co-founded the New Urbanism movement here in the U.S., starting back in the their work began in the 80s. New Urbanism as an organization began in 1993, the Congress for New Urbanism, I participated in it then and ever since. But watching them and then me with them and others trying to sell these concepts of making better cities. And at first we called what we did, which I would kind of loosely describe as the transition back from an automobile-oriented form of placemaking, if you can call those places, to reorganizing the landscape around the unit, not of the car, but of the human, of the pedestrian and the cyclist. And at first, we called what we did neo-traditional town planning, because it was a rejection of modernist town planning and a return to traditional cities of blocks and squares and streets. And then we called it the new urbanism, and we still do. The first term kind of turned off the liberals. The second term, new urbanism, kind of turned off the conservatives. You could just as well have called it best practices in city planning, because that's what it became known as, and that's what our principles are understood as right now. But it wasn't until we, and then eventually I wasn't alone in this, started to frame it through the window of walkability, that people began to be able to relate to it in a meaningful way. So somehow the first step was recognizing that all the stuff we were advocating for was ultimately making places more walkable. The second step was acknowledging that, calling it walkable city planning, and telling cities that we're working with them to make them more walkable. And in fact, I've done 15 of something I call a walkability study in cities all around the US, which I can talk to you about what that entails. And then finally, there was kind of this third step, which was not accidentally realizing, but coming to learn that when you frame good planning through walkability and begin to think about planning in terms of walkability strictly, it makes you a much better planner. So it's not just vocabulary, it's actually an instrumental framework for making the right choices as we design and redesign our cities. And what I mean by that, and I imagine we'll get to this in our conversation, is I and my colleagues have figured out that in order to be walkable, this is what I call my general theory of walkability. In order to be walkable, a place has to provide a walk which is as good as a drive. And in order for the walk to be as good as a drive, it has to do 4 things simultaneously. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. That's a really cool way to analyze how walkable places are. But then if you look at each category, each one comes with a set of mandates, which you can then use in your efforts to replan places, right? So it isn't just that, I should say walkability went from a way to describe what we do to an approach and a framework that actually determines a lot of the steps that we take when we try to make places better.
Okay. So a lot of what you've done surrounds walkability, and I like the idea of walkability because right now my house where I am currently right now, I'm a 15-minute walk from the closest corner store, which is not great. I do have to rely on my car, but there are a lot of people out there who say that North America is way too spread out for walkability, and that a reliance on cars is almost necessary. And it's sort of counter to your point. Like you get a lot of people who go against the idea of walkability because we're so spread out. What do you say to that? And how do you talk to those people?
So when I got into the business and kind of discovered neo-traditional planning and the town of Seaside, which was the poster child for the new urbanism that kicked things off around 1980, that my mentors Andres and Liz designed, and I started working for them first as a student, but ultimately out of school, starting in 1993, full time. I was pretty excited about the idea that we were going to stop sprawl. Like the talk that Andres gave barnstormed the country for a decade. That was called Towns versus Sprawl was my motivation, and it became a book that sold very well. It was the best-selling book of the 1990s. It was called Walkable City. Sorry, it was called Suburban Nation. Suburban Nation was my attempt to turn Andres's famous barnstorming Towns versus Sprawl lecture into a book. And the message of that book is towns good, cities good, neighborhoods good, sprawl bad. And it's a very convincing document as to why. But I kind of got into the business thinking that we can change the fundamental model of development, if not obviously, if not to rebuild what we've already built in North America, but to popularize alternatives to sprawl so that it became the dominant product. And I think we failed at that. And we failed at it for a number of reasons, but principally because so much infrastructure has been built on both sides of the border and our southern border as well, that presumed universal automobile ownership by every adult. And when you begin with that, when you begin with the assumption that everyone will be driving, then you create a landscape that makes it virtually impossible to get around any other way. And it's so inefficient even to apply public transportation, right, to a dendritic, branching, hierarchical road network like you find in Markham or, any of your Toronto suburbs, for example.
I think that actually does hit the nail on the head too, is that we've grown up with the idea that, yes, you do need cars. And if we do want something that is walkable, then we're going to have to fundamentally change how we perceive our surroundings.
But the punchline, Jared, is that what I came to realize is that a much more achievable mission that we are achieving day by day is to provide the walkable, transit-served lifestyle affordably to more and more and more people.
Okay.
So this idea of creating suburban town centers, which are walkable within the miasma of sprawl, which you can do fairly easily if you have a dead mall or a dead office park or just a parcel of 10 hectares or more, I would say. Okay. Or the great trends that we didn't really anticipate in the 1990s, but which hit really hard with the turn of the millennia, was the demographic hourglass of the boomers and the then younger millennials, both post-family and pre-family, right? Kids either out of the house or not yet having kids, who were then ready to not choose their home location based on school quality and size of yard and number of bedrooms, but to reorient themselves to city living. And of course, the millennials back then started moving into cities. And then their parents said, "Hey, that looks cool. Maybe I could get a place there too." And and that coincided, I think, with a change in ethos in our countries around what city living meant. And I talk about Walkable City. I talk in Walkable City, and I'm quoting the great economist Chris Leinberger, about how my generation grew up watching Brady Bunch, Partridge Family, and other shows that were all suburban. Like almost every show, Leave It to Beaver, almost every show on my television that I grew up watching was purely the purest suburban. Right? The Partridge Family lived out of a school bus, or at least they toured out of a school bus. And you guys, you have some gray hair. I don't know, Jared, if you remember, but
I have a lot of gray hair.
We were raised in people my age, and I'm 60, were raised in a suburb living environment, a suburb loving environment. And in fact, the only show on TV that was urban was The Honeymooners, where they had this dingy, musty. That was even before my time, but it was, very grainy. City life was very grainy in the Honeymooners. And then you have this change where this younger generation, the millennials, were raised on Seinfeld and Friends and Sex and the City, and this shift in ethos that all of a sudden the cool place to live was the city. Right. Even Frasier was in Seattle. Yeah. So you had both a demographic shift and a cultural shift in favor of city living, where people who are either in cities or even in suburbs want to have the opportunity for that kind of mixed use 24/7 place to live. And so our challenge now is to reinvigorate our center cities, our existing cities, and to add a ton more housing, something that Canada has done better than the US over the decades. We're trying to catch up now. Unlike in Canada, our center cities were largely emptied of residential during the suburban era. And by the way, my understanding is that we subsidized our highway system through cities, the federal government, 90 cents on the dollar. And in Canada, it was 10 cents on the dollar. So there was a tremendous federal investment in eviscerating center cities with highways in the U.S. That was not matched in Canada because of the limited federal payment for the highways. That and having less of a racism white flight problem than we have here caused the suburban decanting of cities that happen in the U.S. to not happen with the same vigor north of the border. It is interesting, though, the city in Canada that perennially wins the most livable, ranks in the top 3 to 5 of the most livable cities in the world in those indexes that the Economist and other magazines put out, is the one city that refused to let any highways cross through its downtown, and that's Vancouver.
Vancouver, yeah.
And there's a wonderful study by a professor at the University of British Columbia, whose name I'm blanking on, but he's one of the better known professors of landscape history at UBC, that demonstrates both in the US, it's called American and Canadian Cities, Our Differences Are the Same. And it shows how on either side of the border, the cities that invested in inner city highways watched their inner city real estate values tank. And then as they changed their policies, the inner cities came back. There's no better way to devalue your existing inner city real estate than to build a downtown highway, not just because you're slicing through the city, but also because you're incentivizing the dispersion of the population.
Right.
As they said in Rochester, New York, we built an evacuation route. It worked. Everyone evacuated.
So, Jeff, I want to, we've been talking a lot about kind of cities and the walkability of cities. You talked about, suburbs versus the cities and, all this. But you've also done work in smaller communities, maybe not the tiniest spots, but not like the superstar cities, as some people would call them. What does walkability look like in these kinds of places, or what did it look like when you first started doing work there? And what do these kind of mid-sized cities, what are they doing now, and what should they be doing?
Well, I've worked in a lot of suburban cities. I've worked in a lot of small cities, small towns even, like Ada, Michigan, which you've never heard of. It's tiny.
Never heard of that.
We remade the downtown there. Turned a strip mall downtown into a Main Street downtown. They had the benefit of being home to the Amway Corporation, which is giant. So they were well invested in, which helped. I've also worked in a lot of red cities, a lot of more conservative places like Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Oklahoma City and other places. Carmel, Indiana, both suburban and Republican. And it's interesting that if you frame it properly, everyone wants walkability. In these red cities or more business-oriented cities, they understand that placemaking is still key to economic success, or I should say placemaking has risen as the key factor in economic success. Now that the workforce is mobile, even pre-COVID and Zoom, people understood that the talented workforce was mobile and that the way to thrive economically wasn't to create some, aerospace cluster or give away some giant parcel of land with no taxes to a big corporation that would move again to the next free spot 5 years later, but rather to become a place where people want to be. And if you're a place where people want to be, that's where the talent will go. Mayor Cornett in Oklahoma City, where I did a lot of work, he tells the story of how Boeing, no, it was a major airline. It may have been American Airlines, was looking to put a major maintenance facility with a ton of jobs, executives as well as line workers, in Oklahoma City, and they secretly had a bunch of executives just go to Oklahoma City for the weekend and spend the weekend there. And they came back and they told the leadership, we don't want to live in Oklahoma City. It's really a bad place. And that was around the time Oklahoma City was named by Prevention Magazine as the least walkable city in America,
Huh.
which isn't true. I mean, I guess they hadn't been to Lawton, Oklahoma, or some of the other places that compete that are smaller. But the mayor called me in and said, "What can we do?" And I said, "Let's do a walkability study." And we did our very first walkability study. And this pertains to a big city, like, well, or I should say, I mean, I haven't done a walkability study in a very big city, but I mean, I've done them in mid-sized cities like Fort Lauderdale, like Boise, and like Oklahoma City. So a city of that size, or Des Moines, these are capital cities, Des Moines, Iowa, or to a smaller town, it's really not very different. The first thing to do is to just ask the question, like, are you comfortable walking around downtown? Are you happy walking around downtown? And if not, why not? And this kind of dovetails into my earlier mention of these 4 categories: the useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting walk, each one then bringing with it a set of mandates. So what is fascinating, if you think about it, is the useful walk has to do with the uses that you have in your downtown. And the comfortable and interesting walk has to do with how streets are framed to feel like outdoor living rooms. You want to have the proper height to width ratio so that streets really feel like spaces. Then, of course, you don't want blank walls. You don't want surface parking lots. You don't want parking structures right against the sidewalk. You don't want anything boring or too repetitive. These 3 categories, the useful, comfortable, and interesting walk, are principally a function of what's framing the streets. And that's principally accomplished by the private sector. Now, the public sector has tremendous input into zoning choices and investment that cities can make. We have tax increment financing in the US, at least, where the cities can invest in getting the sort of development they want in their downtowns based on anticipated bond revenues, or I should say tax revenues that support bonds. But those are things that the city can only, or town can only influence over the longer term, because it's stuff that the private sector principally is building. The safe walk is where the city or town can make the most changes the most quickly, and actually have the most human impact in terms of saving lives and just making car crashes and pedestrian fatalities and bike crashes go down, because most cities own most of their streets. And Canada is not that different from the US. Here, in any given downtown, we might have a federal highway or a state highway running through it. There's a few exceptions, like in Pennsylvania or Virginia, where the state has a lot more control over almost everything, and that's really hard because state DOTs tend to be pro-car and anti-everything else. But most cities I work in, then, because they own most of their streets, you have the opportunity literally in one term, right? Because officials like to see change before the next election. So you have the opportunity in one term to drastically change the walkability and therefore the success of a downtown. And you can do it through reconstruction, but most of the plans I've done have been through restriping, where if necessary, you lay down a new top coat. You don't move any curbs. You don't change any drainage. You don't have to plant any more trees or anything, although that's certainly nice to do. But you reallocate that limited resource that exists from curb to curb, which is your road space. In Oklahoma City, we eliminated, because their roads were much bigger than their traffic volumes. So we didn't even have to say to them, hey, we have to limit traffic in any way. We said, your traffic is going to keep flowing smoothly. And of course it did. But we eliminated fully a third of the driving lanes. We doubled the amount of on-street parking, which is actually really good for protecting the sidewalk, and the merchants love it. And we created a bike network where there was no bike network at all before we started, without having to move a single curb in that downtown. Now, it so happens they had $200 million they wanted to spend extra because they had the tax increment of a 51-story tower coming into the downtown. So they chose to rebuild almost everything. The fact is, within the exact same rights of way and pretty much similar curb locations, we were able to dramatically change the nature of those streets in a way that simply made them safe. So that
that's
people wanted to walk them again.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that too, because our last episode we were talking about road safety audits and how Good Roads is bringing road safety audits to make streets safer. Thomas and I actually participated in the very first road safety audit course, and I don't know if we've mentioned it since, but we are both, I guess, registered road safety auditors to
Nice.
look at streets and how to make them safer, mainly before building them, but also afterwards. So yeah, taking an example like that, where you reallocate the space, a road safety audit would be a perfect,
Yeah.
I guess, idea to help figure out how to reallocate that space
We
properly.
look at the number of lanes. We look at the width of the lanes. You know, 3-meter lane is a safe downtown lane, but any wider is not safe and should only be wider if it's a major bus route, for example.
Right.
We look at the directionality of traffic. One of the things we're doing all over the U.S. is to take old two-way road networks, which mid to late 20th century were converted to multi-lane one-way networks. We have them all over the U.S.
Yeah,
They're horribly dangerous. Not a one-lane one-way, but when you have a multi-lane one-way and you revert it back to the two-way traffic it once held, you're cutting crashes by a half and injuries by more than that. Similarly, we pull out a ton of signals. We just did a plan for downtown Hyannis, Massachusetts, which is the heart of Cape Cod, the downtown for Cape Cod, southeast of Boston. And of 11 signals downtown, we're eliminating 10. And we're replacing them with always stop signs. Because when you replace a signal with an always stop sign, based on a single study of 199 of them that were converted in Philadelphia, but now backed up by additional studies, the number of severe pedestrian injury crashes drops by 67%.
What are your feelings on roundabouts?
To the intersection. What's that?
What are your feelings on roundabouts instead of those always stops?
Changing an intersection from a crossing to a roundabout is a much larger investment than just pulling out a signal. And in fact, pulling out a signal, presuming you can redeploy it somewhere else someday, which you can, is actually a savings. It's a cost savings, not a cost. Additionally, roundabouts, if they're done well, right? If they're very small and have a mountable center island so that cars have to go slow, but trucks can get over them when they need to. Yeah. If they're done really properly, they are super safe. I'm not against roundabouts per se. I work in Carmel, Indiana, where there's 150 of them. And in a suburban city, they're great. They're just not the most urban street configuration. And they communicate a more suburban and more highway-like, even a slow speed highway-like vocabulary. And so I'm really not a fan of roundabouts in main downtown locations. There aren't many roundabout intersections that are great for shopping. I like to say a roundabout is the safest, most pedestrian-friendly automotive environment that you can create.
So you're sort of creating a hierarchy there, sort of like at the very bottom, you've got signals, then stop signs, and if you can afford it and the application's correct, roundabouts.
But I would put it at the edge of downtown, not right in the middle.
Yeah, right.
Or if you're like, if you can do it like Ben Hamilton Bailey did it in Poynton in England, and you may know this amazing video, Poynton I can't remember the exact name. Poynton Regenerated, it's called. Poynton Regenerated. And it's a video, it's now like 20, 25 years old, but they completely salvaged a dead downtown by replacing a highway junction with a kind of a double peanut about roundabout solution, but one in which it's all pavers and there's no curbs, and it's extremely a shared space sort of roundabout. That's an example of a roundabout that is rather urban, but we haven't built any of those in the US yet that doesn't have a center island, that's, all individual pavers and much more plaza-like. That sort of roundabout I could see being in a main location as it's been tremendously effective in Poynton. And that video on YouTube, Poynton, Poynton Regenerated, I would direct your listeners to. It's really something else. My favorite thing about the video is that as they're planning it, as they're designing it, as they're trying to socialize it, they interview people on the street who say, "Oh, it's going to be an utter disaster. It will be a total nightmare. The carnage, the humanity." And then afterwards, they interview the same person. Who says, "Well, my worst fears, it seems, have not come to pass."
Well, that's really interesting. It's nice to hear about these different types of interventions, and very cost-effective ones, like you've mentioned, just ripping out some signals and putting in stop signs. I want to kind of touch on something that you mentioned something you touched on earlier, Jeff, which was you talked about kind of retrofitting suburbs. So I'm a suburban guy, born and raised. I love walkable places, and I want where I live to be more walkable. And every time I drive by a mall or something, I just think to myself, "Oh, there's so much potential here." Can you talk to us again about what you what are suburbs doing now to kind of put that auto-oriented or auto-only oriented development in the past, and what can they be doing kind of going forward?
So there's two great books. They're textbooks, so they're not cheap, but they're by Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson, and they're called Retrofitting Suburbia, and Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia. Ellen is a prominent professor at the University of Georgia in Atlanta, the examples in that book have to do principally, not entirely, but principally with dead malls and dead office parks that have been remade, where you have, or even strip centers that have been remade, where you have enough acreage to kind of scrape. Maybe you save the anchors, because often the anchors are still viable while the inline stores die. But you save some or all of those facilities, but use the parking fields and then the sites that you do vacate in order to actually introduce what's missing, which is the block structure. And you can't have a walkable place without a good block structure. Now, not every street may be automotive. It isn't like you have to have auto streets surrounding every block. That is the typical shape of an American city, though. The occasional street might be pedestrianized, but essentially it's a porous network of small, slow-speed streets that together create a system of small blocks. And intersection density is probably the greatest indicator you're going to find as you study different cities of how walkable it is. So taking an office park or a shopping mall or some other gigantic block structure and clearing the parking fields, replacing surface parking with structured parking, which means it needs only 1/5 the space, and then using all that extra space that you have to introduce the mix of uses that we're likely missing. If it's a shopping mall or an office park, where's the housing? And by the way, this is why these places are disposable. This is why these shopping malls, strip centers, office parks are truly disposable real estate, which not only, at least in the US, you write down over 12 years. So they essentially have no tax value after 12 years. But secondarily, no one loves them. Why does no one love them? Because no one lives there. You're not going to love a place if you don't live in it. Or I should say, places don't become beloved unless they're inhabited. So the idea of taking one of these places and making it more mixed use. There's a few examples of thriving malls. Most American malls are dying. But there's a few examples of thriving malls like we have here in Natick, Massachusetts, which have become all the more successful because they've had large amounts of housing plopped down around them in mid and high-rise buildings in the parking lots, which is incredible and great. But the real opportunity is office parks, which are post-COVID becoming much less valuable.
Right.
I'm working for a client in Indiana who has a pure office park. It happens to be fully occupied. I wouldn't say all the workers are coming in, but everyone's still paying rent. But it's like 650,000 square feet of office and surface parking and nothing else. So guess what? You structure the parking and you put in a couple thousand housing units and some shops and stuff, and you've got a town. And it's a place. There's a there now. It's not just a real estate product that will decline in value as it depreciates. So that's a real opportunity for the suburbs. The other thing about the suburbs, though, is these new towns in the suburbs, these new you can call them park once environments, right? But they're mixed use environments in the suburbs. That's only viable if you have a big chunk of land. So the larger question in the purest sprawl that covers most of our nations, where those opportunities don't exist, what can you do? And I would say with some regret, these areas will never be walkable. They've got the wrong bones, right? They've got the big block, dendritic branching, hierarchical road system where every drive is from the local to the collector to the arterial to the highway and back again. And there's only one path from anything to anything else. You can still make a difference, though, by looking where the crashes are happening and making interventions just to make those areas safer. Right. Also, a lot of these, and I'm not the first person to bring this to communities, but often a lot of these collector roads do have room for bike lanes, like separated bike lanes that can go in them, or at least arterials might have a shoulder where that's possible.
Right.
Out of the street because people are driving too fast to mix the bikes with traffic. But in these purely driving environments, it's really about safety. It's not about making a walkable society. I would rather see them just abandoned. Now, that's not going to happen, but honestly, the lifestyle that these places impose on their residents is so inefficient, unsustainable, unhealthy, and just, bad for them and for their well-being that you wish more people could just move out.
Yeah. It's funny, going back to the mixed use areas, I'll start with an American example right now. The Arizona Coyotes are looking to build a new arena, and it's simply not just an arena. It's a whole entertainment district. So with their arena, they've got like a shopping area, they've got business centers, and they've got housing. And it's funny because I thought that was interesting that they're putting that all together. They wanted to put it in Tempe. Unfortunately, that didn't get approved. But I went to Ottawa this weekend and saw their arena, and they built that back in the 90s. So it's just a big arena, parking lots, and then businesses around it. And it is a very, very poor use of the space. Like you said, there's one road to anywhere. It took us half an hour to get out of this parking lot in the middle of nowhere. But it's funny to see, like, even, what is it? Oh God, no, it's 50 years now since it's been made, 40-year difference, but how people are updating their buildings and how they want to see spaces built.
I mean, there's no reason to zone anymore by use, right? The noxious, polluting uses are largely under control. The greatest threat to the, habitability of a place is probably large trucks moving in and out, which can be handled properly with the right road network. And anything you do to kind of artificially separate one aspect of our daily lives from another is inefficient.
Right.
And that's why I still scratch my head at the, the great project of the auto age was Autorama in the 1939 World's Fair, held on Long Island, New York City, and GM and Firestone and all of the biggest car company, automotive living companies sponsored the exhibit, which was called the City of Tomorrow. It wasn't called Autorama. It was called Futurama. Futurama, the City of Tomorrow. Autorama, in contrast, was the diner in the lobby of the old GM building, which no longer exists in New York City, where you could sit inside car. I went as a kid and delighted to sit inside a car cabin as I ate my meal. But Futurama was designed by Norman Bell Geddes, who became famous as a city planner because he designed Futurama. In fact, he had no training or experience as a city planner or as an architect. He was an industrial designer who made beautiful chess sets and teapots and eventually automobiles for GM. But they put him in charge of Futurama. And he has this quote that spread internationally without anyone even questioning it. It said, "For the greater convenience of life, we have separated daily activities from each other. It's like, what the hell was he thinking? Like, you hear that, and if you have it all, a critical bone in your body, you have to ask, how does separating our life into these silos, which are then far flung across the landscape at great distance from each other, how does that make life more efficient? It doesn't. It makes life incredibly inefficient. And the only way you can accomplish anything is with this 2-ton piece of machinery strapped to you, right?
Right.
So that was the key moment when the design of our cities departed from any rational understanding of reality. And we're still trying to pedal our way back, or paddle our way back. I would say pedal on a bicycle.
Well, yeah, speaking of bicycles, it's almost funny because you want to take things back to a simplistic time. Like when you were a kid, when everything was close to you, you hop on your bike and you can go to the corner store, you can go to the park, your friends are down the street. And to expand that into like as an adult, when you have everything close to you and it's easy, like it seems like a simplistic approach, but almost the right approach, right? Or am I
I
off
think
base?
what happened was, designing communities or redesigning communities or modifying communities in fear of traffic congestion led the counting of cars and the modeling of traffic to be the fundamental activity of city making moving forward. And so it's quite normal when you go to a place either to add a new, large amount of housing or a shopping center, or to build a new community in a place. One of the first things you have to do is count the uses, do the math, figure out the trips per day, and then size the infrastructure with the anticipation that every single one of those trips is going to be in an automobile, which is an absolutely self-fulfilling prophecy. The average suburban house in the US, last I checked, generates 13 trips a day. So if you've got a few thousand houses, all of a sudden you can't even have a 2-lane road anymore. You have to have a 3 or a 5-lane road.
Yeah.
And when you build an environment like that, of course, no one's going to make the choice to walk. So then the prophecy is fulfilled and everyone is driving. And the other thing you have happening, at least in the US, is that cities grow, towns grow up around roads. And so the typical young town in America is a highway, like a surface highway, not a elevated or major interstate highway, but a surface highway intersection that slowly accreted buildings, but never lost its high speed configuration, right? And so there's never a there. I'm reminded of a song by a Canadian band you may know, the Arcade Fire, called the Suburbs. And there's an amazing line in that song. Do you know it? It says, "First we built the road, then we built the town, and that's why we're still driving around and around and around." It's like, wow, genius. But that's the situation. Is if either temporally or strategically, if road building leads the charge, you will not end up with a livable place. It has to be, enslaved to placemaking if it's going to perform well. And I should also say that because of the tremendous degree to which driving is subsidized, even in Canada, that you pay only a fraction of the true costs of driving. Yeah. For that reason, the only real constraint to driving is congestion. So there's this mythology that you can build your way out of congestion. I guess most people don't believe that anymore. Most people listening to this podcast don't believe that anymore. But most North Americans, I think, believe that you can build your way out of congestion, which isn't true, because the congestion represents an equilibrium. Because the only way that you're really made to pay for your driving life is through time that you're stuck in traffic. And therefore, you will drive more until you can't stand spending another minute on the street. And that's why, as Fred Kent says, he founded the Project for Public Spaces. He said quite accurately that if you plan for cars and traffic, you will get cars and traffic. If you plan for people and places, you'll get people and places. And then Jan Gehl similarly said, famously, throughout the 20th century, cars in our cities behave like water. And those cities that gave cars more space got more cars, and those cities that gave cars less space got fewer cars. It isn't like one city thrived and the other didn't. It's just a question of the outcome that you ended up with, which is why I'm always telling my city clients, you have the ability, you have the choice. You may not believe it, but you have the choice to have as many cars as you want going the speed that you want through your community. That choice is yours to make. And I'm also flabbergasted to see a place like New York City, which obviously could hold. If New York City had, if those avenues in New York had 8 lanes instead of 3 lanes or 4 lanes, do you think they'd be any less crowded? I mean, it's completely random. Well, random's the wrong word, but the number of cars that you have in Manhattan right now are entirely a function of the number of lanes that you have in Manhattan.
Right.
Entirely. It's a completely artificial construct. The number of lanes has determined the number of cars, and any change in the number of lanes will change the number of cars. People are so scared of doing, eliminating 1 lane, which Jeanette Sadiq-Khan did a fair amount of a decade ago to great impact in a positive way. But the degree to which people naturalize, that they take for granted and assume as ineffable the amount of traffic they have in their communities is it's baffling to me.
Honestly, that's something I think if anybody listens to this and you take anything away, like, I want you to take that line. Like, the amount of cars in your community is entirely dependent on how many cars you want in your community.
Yeah. Jeff, I was going to say, Jeff, on a similar vein, we're talking about the number of cars in the community, and our members are the municipal people that make these decisions. We're starting to see now a lot of cities and towns get rid of parking minimums. And that, I think, is very, correlated to, all these, if you have more cars, place to park your car, you're probably going to be, it's easier just to drive here. I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, but why should we get rid of parking minimums?
So parking minimums refers to private property. It refers to the off-street parking. Donald Shoup, famously, the author of The High Cost of Free Parking, said that the off-street parking minimum is a fertility drug for cars. And it absolutely is. And that's exactly how it functions. And as he also famously says, eliminating the off-street parking requirement minimum will not get rid of off-street parking. It will just allow the market to function properly. Because what you have right now is artificially mandated and often arbitrary and often wrong numbers that cities require developers to provide, or just a merchant to provide. And he gives the example, I think it's a piano sales store that wants to become a restaurant. And they realize that in order to become a restaurant from a piano sales store, they need to somehow out of thin air materialize 30 new parking spaces because of the ratios that change between those two uses, which don't exist. So of course the renovation doesn't happen. And he just emphasizes the artificial and unnecessary impediment to the free market that's happening here. And he has a wonderful thought experiment, which is in The High Cost of Free Parking, which is, what if we had a similar law that required all restaurants to provide dessert free with all meals? And what would happen to our society if that happened? And I won't walk you through it because I can't remember exactly all the hilarious ramifications that ensue when that happens, but it's the same nature of rule. And as someone who serves private developers as much as cities, I can tell you the private developers they'll figure out how much parking they need, because if they don't have enough parking, they won't get their loans and their project won't succeed. But they're going to do a very careful analysis, and my clients understand very well it's worth paying, mid 5 figures for a parking study, because every parking space they don't build, particularly if it's structured, that's like $30,000 in their pocket. So they're going to size the property correct. They're going to size the parking correctly, and they're going to do the effort to share parking, to have complementary uses, sharing a single space wherever possible. I've worked on projects where, I've inherited a plan where the offices were nowhere near the housing. Like, well, guys, if you put the offices and the housing on either side of a hidden parking structure, you can build half the parking. That's nice, right? I'm like, oh, we hadn't thought of that, you know? So simple stuff like that. And maybe one last comment in the context of good roads, the sort of tidbit I'll be offering in person. I know you learned a lot about road design and safety in your road audits. I'm curious if you learned this little ditty, which is there are 3 different studies that show pretty conclusively that when you remove the center line from a 2-lane, 2-way street, people drive 7 miles an hour slower.
Huh.
I did not know that.
Which is about the amount they were speeding before. So a simple measure to eliminate speeding on many of your streets is to eliminate the center line.
Huh.
And it's a very telling example because it describes what technically we call risk homeostasis, the way people adjust their behavior to the level of risk that they're comfortable with.
Right.
The center line tells you can go pretty much any speed next to it, but if you don't cross it, you won't hit anyone, right? And you take that away, and all of a sudden you have drivers behaving the way you want them to, which is understanding that there is a risk of a collision, and that they need to proceed with a little more caution.
Well, it's funny, like a bunch of the country roads here in Ontario don't have center lines, and when you mentioned that, I just thought back to it, and you do tend to slow down a little bit and even edge over towards the shoulder a bit to avoid that crash. But so before we drain you of all these fantastic tidbits and everything, and then you have nothing to talk about at the conference, let's call it there. In a couple of minutes, do you have anything you want to tell people who will be at the conference to see you?
No, I'm just super excited to meet the crowd. I presume we're going to set up a book signing so I can meet people more in person after the event as well.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
And I do hope that U.S. politics allow my visit to Canada to be temporary. However, we'll see.
Well, we'd be glad to have you if it's otherwise. But okay. Thank you so much, Jeff, for stopping by and chatting with us. We look forward to seeing you at the conference. Everybody else, check out everything conference related on our website at goodroads.ca/conference. Make sure you register in a lot of time. Early bird ends, the end of this month, Thomas? Pretty soon anyway, so make sure you get on that. Save yourself some money. If you're following us,
find out more about me at our website, which is speckdempsey.com, SPECKDEMPSEY, Dempsey, like the boxer.
Awesome. I'll put that in the show notes, and we have you front and center on the Good Roads app, which should be coming out soon. I had to change your website because that changed since I set it up in December. So we'll make sure we'll get that all on there. If you're following us on the socials, make sure to check us out on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, all your up-to-date conference stuff. The Guelph Road School is happening right after, so make sure you check that out as well. There are a lot of great courses there to help you run your municipalities. If you're watching this on YouTube, give us a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe, because it's not just the podcast that goes up here. We offer tons of great content to help you run your municipality as efficiently as possible. Also, leave us a comment. Give us your feedback. We love to hear from you. If you have any specific questions for Jeff, leave them there. We'll make sure to get them to him. And or come to the conference and ask him at the book signing. So until the next episode, everybody, take it easy.